My name is Eleanor Grace Whitman. I'm 38 years old, and I live in a two-bedroom walk-up on the edge of Lincoln Park in Chicago. I manage operations for Whitman and Hargrove, the consulting firm my father founded and the one my older brother, Grant, inherited like a crown he never polished. I keep my life orderly because when everything else is spinning, my father's Parkinson's tremors, my mother's silent storms, I can at least make sure the spreadsheets balance and the coats are hung. Right now, I'm exhausted in the specific way sleep cannot touch. Alert, hollow, and waiting for something to break or to be broken. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. This is hard to tell, and a little act like that helps me believe this matters beyond the walls that built me. I tell you these things because I need you to know who I am before I tell you how deeply I was trained, brick by brick, to hold other people's standards and to tidy my own needs into the corners. My life smells like coffee at 5 a.m., lemon-scented disinfectant, the metallic tang of cold city air through an ill-sealed window, and the faint scent of my father's aftershave, bergamot and regret. My mornings begin with a ritual. Pills lined like soldiers on the counter for my father, lunch packed for my mother's cautious vegetarianism, the meeting notes printed 3 times because one is never enough. People at the office call me Eleanor with a certain punctuation, respectful, professional, but never close. At home I'm called Ellie in the tones the family uses when they want nothing from you but your labor. Ellie, refill the glasses. Ellie, pick up the dry cleaning. Ellie, take the dog out. Those little orders, the ones that sound like routine, are the mortar that kept my childhood home upright. I learned to answer them like breath. When I was a girl, I thought it was normal that I was downstairs sweeping after dinner while mother sat with her hands folded and a book of puzzles, solving her own quiet world. I thought it normal that Grant, 7 years older, polished, excused, wasn't asked to fold napkins because he had an important call or a meeting to prepare for. I thought it normal that the house had a room where my father stored his old awards, and I had a drawer where I kept my loneliness. It felt like tradition, an inheritance of habitual neglect, dressed in the language of responsibility. The truth, which I began to understand later, is that the family had roles, costumes to be worn at dinner and at the boardroom table. My mother performed the part of gracious hostess with an invisible string attached to its tail. Control. Grant performed the part of successor, ingratiating to clients and aggressively absent at home. I was assigned a role with no title. Housekeeper, crisis manager, confidant. I was the person everyone assumed would do the small, invisible things that make a family's public life possible. I didn't expect applause. I expected to be seen as efficient, not integral. The business dinner was meant to be one of those polished events where legacy and deals collided. Clients flown from New York. Partners from across the Midwest. My father would smile with his mouth and not his eyes. My brother would rehearse jokes that landed like coins on marble. My mother would select her dress in pale blue, safe, unnoticeable, and the staff would make everything appear effortless. For weeks before the dinner, I reheard the script in my head, checked the seating chart, confirmed dietary restrictions, briefed the catering team, print extra menus, make sure my father's medication schedule was set so he wouldn't be confused under the dim restaurant lighting. I set alarms, coordinated drivers, and triple confirmed the table linens. At night, my shoulders tightened into a bar of steel and my heart beat slow and stubborn beneath it. I dreamed in checklists and wakefulness. At the office I had allies. Small constellations of people who knew the truth of my competence. A junior analyst named Ben would drop me a text that said simply, "You got this, Ellie," when he'd see how slammed I was. Marisol from HR would bring me coffee when she passed my desk, and sometimes, when the office lights dimmed late, she would stand at my door and ask, "Do you want to talk?" Those moments stitched me to life outside the house, a reminder that I wasn't only the family's unpaid help. But the house, my parents' house, was the axis. There I was conduit and container. The order of things was such that when the business people arrived, it was assumed I would greet them with a warmness that meant nothing. "Serve with a smile," my mother would say, meaning the smile of someone who accepts her lot. In the weeks leading up to the dinner, my name in the event schedule read, Logistics and Homeowner Liaison. It didn't sound like a position because it wasn't meant to be one. My body kept the ledger of that erasure. My right shoulder ached from carrying packages at dusk. My stomach tightened with a small, incessant nausea that no antacid could soothe. The nights before big events are worst for people like me. They are filled with the knowledge that everything depends on your ability to be invisible and indispensable at once. My hands would go numb at the thought of the dinner's clinking silver and the polite laughter. I would lie awake listening to the radiator wheeze, convincing myself I could perform until the room was a picture and no one had to see the rest. "Ellie," my mother had said one afternoon earlier that week, when she found me checking the caterer's invoice in the kitchen, "remember, people in our circle appreciate seamlessness. We owe them that. And Grant, well, he'll be taking the lead on introductions. Make sure the coats are managed. People hate fuss at these things. People also like to be asked to sit down at their table." I had thought but not said. My voice had been relegated to a quiet place. By then I had perfected a face for the world. Composed, efficient, apologetic in a way that suggested I knew my place. That sentence, "They treated me like a maid," doesn't capture the slow accumulation of assumptions, the daily grind of being the person who cleans up both the spills and the reputations of the people you love. It doesn't capture the small violences of being expected to vanish. For a long time, I believed being unseen was the same as being loved. But there is a difference between being loved and being useful. So I prepared. I bought new undergarments that wouldn't show under my dress, ironed my shirts, rehearsed my smiles until they didn't feel fake. At my lowest moments, I thought about calling in sick and letting the house stewardess figure it out. But I had learned to be afraid of the consequences of my absence. The worried phone calls, the thin anger that flew off my mother's tongue like a small, sharp bird. I feared being the one to break the picture frame of our family portrait because in this house, fractures were never named. They were hidden. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I say that because I learned later that solidarity is both a shield and a light. For now, I needed light. I needed something to guide me through what I believed would be one more night of being overlooked. On the morning of the dinner, I woke with a metallic taste in my mouth and a ring of heat around my temples. The world outside was a thin blue, late November, the river a slate line through the city. I wrapped my coat around me and walked the familiar route to the office, carrying a box of menus and a calm that felt borrowed. There is a kind of bravery in minor things. Showing up, making the coffee, reminding the driver to check the trunk. I believed for years that bravery was small and solitary. At least, until the dinner began to rewrite the manuscript I had been writing for 3 decades. The ballroom at the Drake Hotel smelled like citrus and raincoat polish, a blending of oyster steam and lavender soap that made me think absurdly of the housecoat my mother wore when she pretended to tidy the study. The chandeliers hung like frozen stars. Men in navy suits and women in elegant crinolines moved like fish. Slick, practiced, shimmering. We arranged place cards and polished silverware until my fingertips went white. Grant glided through the room as if it were a stage built for him. He greeted clients with his ready smile and the casual handshakes that say, "I own my world." He wore the tux my father had worn the night the company reached $1 million in revenue, an altarpiece of another time. Watching him, I felt a small, old rage. The quiet, accumulated heat of being the one consigned to the margins while someone else took the light. "Ellie, please make sure the guest from Minneapolis gets a window seat," my mother called before she settled into a cluster of old colleagues. She didn't look up when she spoke, as if calls to me were as routine as the hum of the refrigerator. I was the air conditioner, always on and unnoticed unless broken. I moved like a ghost, adjusting place cards, smoothing napkins. Guests often mistook me for a member of the catering staff. Sometimes a client would ask for more bread and I would reach to get it, and their gratitude would land on me like surprise. The company's outside counsel, Mr. Riddle, with a voice like gravel and an eye for status, nodded to me once with the small deference one gives to well-informed help. It's strange how you can stand in a room and still feel invisible. I am an odd depth of irony because at the office I run operations. I am the one who writes the emergency plans, processes payroll, and has once pulled a midnight rescue when the firm's network crashed. My colleagues know me as precise, patient, and relentless. Yet in my family home, none of those qualities translate into recognition. They translate into expected service. That afternoon, a low-level panic that had nothing to do with the event began to coil in my chest. I had found 3 days prior an envelope tucked into the bottom drawer of my father's desk. It was a copy of a letter from a bank discussing a restructuring of debt, something I had been handling informally for months. I had been quietly moving funds, extending lines of credit, attaching my own credit card as temporary backup when corporate accounting was slow. It was messy and illegal and necessary. The company cash flow had been shaky after several losing quarters, and the family had not wanted to alarm marketing. My small, silent acts had become the seam that kept things together. I had not told anyone about the envelope because fear has a comfortable way of becoming loyalty. I had been raised to protect the facade. But when I unfolded the letter and saw a paragraph that mentioned restructuring to consolidate liabilities and consider divestiture of underperforming assets, I realized my role was not only domestic. I was also a clandestine financial midwife. If the truth came out that my personal accounts had been used to mask the company's weakness, the whole house of cards could collapse. Grant, who knew the public face only, could lose his position, clients could withdraw, and the family, my parents, could be judged harshly. I kept this secret in the same place I kept the stacks of clean napkins, tidy, folded, and hidden. But secrets are demandingly alive. They live under the skin and make your hands shake in cold air-conditioned rooms. Near the head table, I noticed Lydia, a junior partner, whispering to Ben and Marisol. Those three were more than colleagues. They were the ones who saw me with my sleeves rolled up in the office, who had once stayed late because I cried quietly at my desk after my father's diagnosis. Lydia's eyes found mine, and she gave me the smallest of nods, an island of acknowledgement in a sea of polite blindness. "You're doing everything," she mouthed, and I felt stunned by gratitude and shame. Gratitude because someone saw me in the room. Shame because I realized how much I had let my role become normalized. The dinner began with small talk and the clink of crystal. My father smiled when he addressed the table, words practiced and firm. Grant introduced a new partner and told a story about how the company had weathered storms in the past. Laughter rolled over the room like a practiced tide. My mother sipped water with the delicate patience of someone who has held her breath for years. Halfway through the third course, a young client, a woman named Priya, poised and sharp, slid from her seat and approached me in the service area. "Excuse me, are you with the event staff?" she asked, voice low and careful. "No," I said. I'm with the firm. I'm handling things tonight." Her face softened in a way I hadn't expected. "Good. I wanted to tell you. Your father told a story earlier about a consultant who fixed a system for him during the hospital closure last spring. I think the person we have in mind might be him. We owe a lot to how quickly you kept things running." I didn't know whether to accept the compliment or deflect it. "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate that." Then, in a small reckless moment, I told her something I had not told the people who lived with me. "You have no idea how much is done behind the curtains." She looked at me for a long second. "Actually," she said, "I think some of us do. There's an analyst from our Minneapolis office who mentioned your name in a meeting last month. He said you saved a project. He said you were the reason the team didn't fold." The world narrowed to the space between that sentence and my next breath. I had never wanted public recognition. I had been taught to be quiet, to be helpful without being visible. But standing there, in a suit that belonged more to the household than to the boardroom, I felt a small bud of indignation. It hurt that people outside my family knew my worth and my family did not. Then Grant, who had been laughing a table over, looked across the room and sneered half to himself. "Leave it to the help to think they're the hero," he said loud enough for one of our neighbors to hear. His voice oiled through the table like a knife through linen. The snicker that followed was quiet and cruel. I felt every pair of eyes flick to me. For a moment the room held its breath. My face felt hot, my ears filled with blood. The training of my life. Immediate soothing, immediate service. rose like a reflex. I moved to reach for the bread basket, to tuck myself into the parts of the room that shouldn't be used to measure a person. "Grant," Lydia said, and I heard the steadiness of someone who knows how to pick her battles. That's not fair." The words hung between them, and I felt something else unfurling. Other people removing themselves from the role of passive audience. Marisol stood up, her chair scraping softly. Ben straightened, his jaw tight. Voices began to flutter around the table, small and then larger. "He's right, Ellie has kept things together," someone said. It was a man from legal whose name I had only heard in conference calls. "She coordinated with our IT team during the outage. She kept payroll from failing in August. She did this." He gestured to me, and the gesture felt like a hand pulling me into daylight. The small avalanche had begun. It didn't arrive with a drumbeat. It arrived like a whisper that gathered steam. Colleagues who had quietly known my contributions were stepping up. Clients murmured their confirmation. People I had only met at meetings nodded. And in those nods there was a sense of solidarity that felt like warmth. Grant's face changed. I saw confusion, then anger. My mother shrank back into her shell, her eyes avoiding the room like a child who has been discovered in a lie. It was then I realized one of the unseen currents of our family had been the assumption that the very acts that made the company, my acts, were not things that deserved credit in the public frame. They were domestic labor. They were invisible. "Enough," Grant said at last, a tight edge to his voice. "This isn't the time to make a spectacle. Isn't it?" Lydia's voice cut through the pretense like linen. "Isn't it always? We don't make a spectacle. We make a statement. There's a difference." She had a point. You could file an HR complaint. You could whisper grievances. But the room had already shifted into a different moral geometry. People were no longer willing to collude with the erasure of someone because of family ties. If this is resonating, share in the comments. Has something like this happened to you? I'm reading everything. I say that because community is part confession and part catharsis. You can't be the only one who was trained to be invisible. The dinner that night did not dissolve into chaos. It didn't need to. What happened instead was subtler and, in some ways, more devastating. The norms that had held my family together for 30 years were publicly re-examined. People spoke up about my work. Clients expressed gratitude. The room's energy reorganized around the fact that I had been doing work both domestic and corporate, and that work deserved a name. But naming is only the start. The most dangerous things in a house are the secrets that everyone knows but refuses to verbalize. For the first time, those secrets were starting to be spoken aloud. When the chorus of affirmation began, it wasn't theatrical. No grandstanding, no dramatic gestures. It was a slow, accumulating pressure of voices that took up space where my family had been content to keep silence. Mr. Hawthorne from New Jersey, one of our firm's oldest clients, leaned in and said, "Eleanor, we need to recognize who is doing the work." His voice was a velvet hammer. It hit and it left an impression. Grant's face hardened. He went from bewildered to indignant in a blink. "Why are you all making this about the household staff?" he snapped. His whisper sharp with insult. "Ellie, honey, go check the coats. People will need to leave soon." The kindness of his words was a poisoned sugar. The room tensed, and for a moment reflex took over. I felt the old acquiescence lift like a thick shawl. My hands, which had been steady all evening, trembled as if from cold. The air felt tight around my ribs. "No," I said. The word was quieter than I expected, but it landed. The room hushed in the peculiar way rooms do when the weather changes and the air weighs heavy with undisclosed things. It was as if my no created a small vacuum. "Ellie." My mother's voice was a brittle thing, the sound of porcelain under pressure. "Dear Mom," I said, looking straight at her. The word felt enormous and new on my tongue. "I'm not the help." Ben, who had always been a quiet observer, stood up. "She's not," he said. "You ask her to do things no one else does. At the office she runs operations. People here know that." A murmur went through the table like wind. The cool light of the chandelier slid across faces and found the place where my family's version of dignity had been propped up by unpaid labor. I could feel my father's hand in his lap, his fingers tapping against the stem of his glass, a nervous rhythm. Grant's jaw worked. "Fine," he said. "Let's make it official then. Ellie, I suppose now you're running the company while I eat dinner. Please." The laugh he gave was crueler for being half-hearted. I wanted to tell him then that I'd been carrying the company's secrets in my wallet, that my credit card statements were perhaps the most honest ledger of the family's desperation. I wanted to show him the envelope from the bank with numbers that didn't add up to the narrative he'd been fed. But my voice unclenched into something else, somewhere between mercy and resolve. "My job has always been operations," I said, and my words were clean. "And when the company needed me, I supported it. I did not sign up to be demeaned in my own home. I know the difference between respect and orders." The table fell quiet. Felt like being inside a held breath. I looked at the faces around me, clients, colleagues, my family, and I saw something remarkable. People who had known me at work were starting to narrate my life out loud, and with each sentence the story I had been allowed to be changed. Somebody in the back, one of our external partners, cleared his throat and said, "It's not right to reduce someone's contributions to service because of family ties. In the boardroom we value transparency. In families we value tradition. But when the two collide, fairness should be the guide. You might imagine that family matters are private, that flouncing in public is gauche and messy. Perhaps, but there is a line between privacy and complicity. For years my family had conflated the two. They'd used the privacy of the home to hide the indignities they'd inflicted on me. Now in public those indignities wore clearer labels. Grant's posture shifted from mocking to calculating. "If we're going to discuss this," he said, "we should do it properly. Tonight's not the time." "Maybe it is," Lydia said. "Maybe it's always the time when people's dignity is at stake." At that, an older partner, a woman named Allison, calm as smoke, pushed her chair back and stood. "I've been to more board dinners than I can count," she said, voice measured. "I've watched people be pushed aside because they didn't fit a particular image. Ms. Whitman has been operating under everyone's radar. That ends tonight. We recognize her contribution. We also don't tolerate family humiliation passed off as household management." When a senior partner in a room like that speaks, her words have an arc like a gavel. The air seemed to rearrange. My mother made a small sound, half protest, half plea, but the chorus around us had shifted. The people who were supposed to be clients and socialites had become witnesses. After Allison spoke, a quiet momentum took hold. People told small stories. How Eleanor had coordinated a last-minute change in a client presentation, how she'd handled a leaked slide deck, how she'd rallied staff during a software outage. Each anecdote was a stitch stitching a new identity to me. Not maid, not invisible, but a professional whose labor sustained a firm. The shock on Grant's face was honest. "You used personal cards to bridge corporate gaps?" he asked incredulously, as if such pragmatism should have shocked him more for its impropriety than for its loyalty. "I did what needed to be done," I answered. "I did not want our people to lose pay. I didn't want vendors to be unpaid. I didn't want the office to close. If that was irresponsible, it was also necessary." There was a silence then that tasted like the eye of a storm. Some of the clients shifted in their chairs, suddenly seeing my brother with new eyes. Not merely a polished successor but the son of a family that had used another human as a seamstress of their reputation. The social code that had kept things civil at cocktail parties began to crack. The next moments were messy and real. My father, who had been quiet all evening, coughed and cleared his throat. "Eleanor," he said, and for once his voice trembled in a way that made me think of morning light through blinds, soft, hesitant. I didn't realize the extent of what you did. It wasn't an apology. Apologies in our house were cheap, like silverware you'd polish and set aside. But it was an admission. My mother made no sound, just an italicized movement with her hand, something like a retreat. Grant's face was ashen. His hands fidgeted with the menu. When the dinner wound down, the guests lingered. People came to our corner one by one, not to gossip but to offer thanks. Some left business cards with notes. Let's discuss formal recognition. Let us reward this contribution. We value you. I felt the tide of the room change from erasure to acknowledgement. The feeling was dizzying and disorienting, as if I'd been underwater my whole life and someone had finally opened a window. Backstage, in the less ornate space where servers wheeled away the plates, Marisol hugged me tightly. "You did this so gracefully," she whispered. "But you don't have to do it alone." That was when it happened, the small, private pivot that would alter everything. Lydia pulled me to the side, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and clarity. "You need to step back from being everyone's invisible miracle," she said. "We can help you formalize your role. The firm owes you more than a nod. And your family, well, that's a different thing. But this is a start." Her words were a relief like rain after drought. For the first time, it felt possible to imagine a version of myself that wasn't solely defined by the small labors that made a world run for everyone else. It felt possible to claim credit without guilt. If you're still with me, don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. It will matter more than you think. This next part. It gets heavier, but it also holds the turning. As the hotel lights dimmed for the last time and coats were gathered with a new, gentler efficiency, I felt a complex tangle inside me. Relief, fear, and a small giddy hope. The people who had once treated me as invisible had been called out by the people who mattered in our business world. That alone was a miracle and a reckoning. The night of the dinner changed the architecture of our family in ways that were immediate and slow. Grant retreated into a small, furious shadow. My mother began to speak less in public and more in letter-like sentences delivered across the hallway. My father, for a while, seemed to look at me with an unreadable distress, like someone whose glasses had been taken off and who suddenly noticed how the world was made up. In the days that followed, the office was a hub of quiet negotiations. Allison and Lydia's voices together summoned a kind of institutional integrity I had never expected my family to receive. There were proposals, titles, compensation adjustments, a formal acknowledgement from the board, and an offer to move me into a paid, recognized role within the firm. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where the labor I did at home and the labor I did in the office weren't two separate ledgers but pieces of the same life. At home, things were more complicated. My mother retreated into old patterns, small silences that felt like walls. "We didn't mean to," she began once, but then her words folded into the air. She would busy herself with crossword puzzles and the radio, as if noise could be armor. When I tried to talk to her, she changed the subject to something domestic. The laundry, the neighbor's lawn care, the way the china should be stored. It was an evasion dressed as pragmatism. Grant's reaction was more combustible. He started making calls, quiet, strategic ones. I overheard him once, telling someone that this was a family matter and that personal grievances were being weaponized by outside influences. It was the old tactic. Retreat to the language of legitimacy as though that could erase the evening. He framed my colleague's support as an attack on family unity, weaponizing the idea of loyalty like a cudgel. The most surprising development was how some of our extended family reacted. Aunt Marianne, who had once criticized my boots for not being gauche enough, sent me a card. Not a note of praise exactly, but a small admission. "Perhaps I was blind," it read. The cards were small reparations, and tenderness arrived in odd forms. Then came the revelation that broke something open and forced a real discussion. Someone, an anonymous client, sent a copy of my father's bank statement to a partner in Atlanta. The statement was muddled and showed several transfers that were inconsistent with declared income. It was the kind of paper trail that lawyers salivate over and accountants dread. I felt my stomach drop. The envelope hit the firm like a thunderclap. At first, the firm tried to contain it. Meetings behind closed doors. Legal counsel at the table. But once documents are in the light, they don't go back into the drawer. The firm's board demanded an audit, and with it, a level of scrutiny that turned private family habits into public records. Grant accused me, in a tone I'd never heard from him, of recklessness. "You put us at risk," he said, his voice hollow with something like genuine hurt. "Why would you expose our private finance to the firm?" "What do you mean, expose?" Yes. My body knew all the small betrayals. It recognized their shapes, the way people would try to frame me as a source of instability rather than a refuge of stability. I did my best to patch holes. That doesn't mean I intended any of this. You should understand, none of us are simple villains or saints. My actions to personally guarantee payroll were desperate, born of fear and a need to preserve the people who had been hard to leave. But those choices had consequences. The company, under legal scrutiny, needed clear lines. I was suddenly a human ledger ripe for interpretation. I found myself in a meeting room, the fluorescent lights humming like a hive. Attorneys on both sides circled words and dates. Grant sat across from me like an adversary with family ties. My mother sat nearby, hands folded, her face made of paper. I couldn't breathe, as if someone had closed the room's windows and told me to sit still and be judged. In the middle of that meeting, Lydia stood up. She had been quiet, watching, taking notes. "You can't turn Eleanor into the villain here just because she stepped into a void," she said. Her voice had a legal edge, but beneath it was something fiercer, a human insistence. She presented data. Emails, logs, payment records showing that I had indeed reached out to vendors, made arrangements, and had been doing so to keep employees paid. She showed how, without those interventions, vendors would have pulled back and salaries would have bounced. The room absorbed the proof like a body realizing an old bruise. It wasn't a clean exoneration. There were legal improprieties to unpack. But these facts reframed the moral narrative. I had been saving operational lives in the dark. I had also mixed personal resources with corporate needs. A dangerous line. The firm offered to audit properly and to move toward reimbursing what I had used under a formal arrangement. They wanted to convert my unpaid labor into recognized, contractual responsibility. Part of me felt relief. Another part felt the old ache, because recognition often came with strings and a ledger to be balanced. At home, the aftermath was more human and less tidy. Grant would not admit fault. He shrank into a silent resentment that later erupted in slamming doors. My mother tried to soften everything with food. Small cakes, extra portions, like a pacifier. My father grew quieter, sometimes asking about things he'd never asked before, like how payroll worked or what insurance meant, as if curiosity could be a way to regain control. But the most meaningful thing that happened in that messy time was the support that came from the people who had publicly stood for me. Clients who had been at the dinner sent notes. Colleagues offered to be witnesses in case of legal complications. Ben, who had been a friend since the intern days, sat with me and let me cry at my desk into my sweater. "You did too much for too long," he said. "But you didn't do it alone." Those days were bruises and balm. Felt raw. I slept badly. My hands would twitch and I'd wake at 3 a.m. with the taste of metal in my mouth. I would walk the city in the cold and feel both lighter and more vulnerable, like a person who had shed a heavy coat but now had to reckon with the skin beneath it. Through all this, a secret surfaced that surprised me more than it did anyone else. One morning, while sorting through a box of letters in my father's study, letters he'd kept from a woman named Margaret who had once worked at the firm in a junior role, I found a faded photograph of a younger version of my mother, and another woman smiling arm in arm. There were notes tucked between the pages that hinted at a friendship, and eventually a falling out I had never known about. My father's handwriting was careful, full of apologies. It told a story of company politics, of favors traded and reputations managed. In a way, it explained why my mother had been so fragile about status. She had been burned before, and the protective shell she built around herself did not include tenderness for the person who quietly held everything together. It was a small human betrayal, one generation's choices bleeding into the next. It explained much and nothing at all. It did nothing to fix the pain but helped me understand that the patterns I had been trapped in weren't personal failures but inherited scripts. When the dust settled to something like a routine, The firm offered me an interim role, compensation, title, and a seat at the operations table. It was both liberating and terrifying. The offer came with conditions. We would need to formalize the funds, disentangle personal and corporate accounts, and present a united front to clients and regulators. It meant talking to Grant, admitting our family's failures publicly, and learning to hold boundaries in a place that had never needed them. If this is resonating, please, if you can, give the video a like. It helps others find this story. And if you've been on the receiving end of being taken for granted, know you're not invisible. I'm reading all your comments, and they mean more than you know. The changes that followed were neither instant nor complete, but they were decisive. I accepted the interim role as Director of Operations, with a contract, a salary, and a clarity that felt like a map for the first time. The firm promised to reimburse the funds I had fronted, and legal handled the messy accounting with a kind of bureaucratic tenderness that soothed some of my fear. It was, in practical terms, a restoration of value. In human terms, it was a permission slip to be seen. Grant was furious, predictably. Our conversations became formal affairs, filled with legalese and distance. He wrote me an email once, 3 pages, about loyalty and betrayal. The tone was wounded entitlement. I read it twice and then deleted it. Sometimes people abandon the possibility of reconciliation because it feels safer than the work of change. He retreated into the firm, more distant and defensive than before. My mother, in time, softened. Not in a dramatic redemption. She is not the kind of person to make grand gestures, but in smaller ways. She began to ask for help in the kitchen, to say thank you when I slipped into the role she had taken for granted. Once, in the narrow silence of early morning, she touched my hand and said, "I didn't know how to." And then she left the sentence floating between us like a paper boat. It was the most she could say, and it mattered. The community that rallied around me after the dinner did not evaporate when the headlines cooled. Clients offered advisory roles with no strings attached. Lydia and Allison made sure I had mentors at the firm who could support me in the transition. Ben and Marisol became my steady allies. People who showed up, brought me lunches, and reminded me that single acts of courage are rarely, if ever, solo. A year later, when we held our annual board meeting, my name appeared on the minutes as Director of Operations. It was a small line in black ink, but it was proof that something had been made real. I still go to my mother's house sometimes, because family is not a contract. It's a series of fibers that can fray and sometimes be rewoven. We are learning to ask for help and to give it without an agenda. We are learning to separate love from utility. I won't tell you this is a happy ending. Families are messy, and forgiveness is not a tidy symptom. Some things broke too far to be fixed. Grant and I are cordial but distant. We are like 2 rivers that once merged and now run parallel, close but not the same. My father died the following spring. In the hospice room, his hand was small and cool in mine. He couldn't always remember my name at the end, but on a clear afternoon he whispered, "You kept us together." It was not an apology. It was something smaller, fragile, but it landed in a place inside me that had been hollow for years. The real lesson, if there is one, is that dignity is not given away. It is asked for and, often, reclaimed in the presence of witnesses. Solidarity is not a spectacle. It is a labor of attention. When people at that dinner stood up for me, they did not merely elevate me in a social moment. They shifted the moral economy of my family. They showed that the small acts we perform, refilling glasses, preventing layoffs, staying up all night to soothe a crisis, are not invisible. They are part of the narrative of worth. I learned to set boundaries gradually. I learned that saying no can be an act of preservation rather than aggression. I found that my value wasn't dependent on how much I could do for others at the expense of my own life. I began to see that being recognized at work did not require me to be diminished at home. I began to build a life that accounted for both compassion and limits. If you take one thing away from this, let it be that people who make themselves indispensable by disappearing their own needs deserve to be called forward. If you've been flattened by expectations, familial or otherwise, know that community can be a blade and also a balm. Please, if this resonated, consider subscribing and sharing your story in the comments. These stories are how we learn the language for dignity. I still set the table sometimes. I still iron napkins for holiday dinners because ritual matters and because I like the tactile meditation of folding cloth. But I do it as a choice, not as an assignment. I pick my battles. I say yes to things that honor me and no to things that erase me. That difference, between being chosen and being conscripted, is the quiet revolution of my life. And in case you're wondering if the business dinner changed everything, the answer is both yes and no. It exposed the fault lines and made some repair possible. It forced my family to reckon with its own habits. It brought allies into my life who showed me how to claim space. But it also showed me how fragile recognition can be. How quickly privilege will try to reclaim its old shapes. The last time I walked into a room full of polished people, I wasn't the person who moved like a ghost. I took the coat of my own dignity and wrapped myself in it like a warm, necessary armor. People still assume things sometimes. But now, when that assumption comes, I have learned to meet it with a steady voice. And when others, colleagues, friends, strangers, stand up beside me, I let them. There is a strange, deep comfort in being witnessed. Thank you for listening to this. If a part of this story touched you, leave a comment. Has something like this happened to you? I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, please subscribe. Sharing these moments keeps us human and keeps us honest. We were not perfect people before that night. None of us are. But we were people given a chance to change the script we've been handed. In the end, I learned that being treated like a maid was never about the chores. It was about the refusal to see someone fully. And when everyone stood up for me at that business dinner, they stood up for the idea that being seen matters.